Okay. So yes, we're gonna get this topic covered for sure.
Good.
And then do we feel like we're done for the season? I feel like there for a while we were kind of um, touch and go. I would get one person, I would get no people. So I was wondering if we're ready to kind of take our summer break and we can regroup in the fall. I'm happy with that. I have a few questions that we can just push down into the fall. Does that sound okay to everybody?
Well, it's up to
Sounds
you.
fine.
What were you saying, Karen?
I said it's up to Katie.
Yeah, I think you're going to have enough on your plate, Katie.
I am.
With
That's true.
Yeah,
Starting next week.
I know.
All right. Well, why don't we do that? We'll call this our last one for the spring, and then we'll start up again in at the end of August or September. That sounds
Okay.
reasonable.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, for tonight, we can get going here. Finally, we're ready for this question that we've been holding on to for a long time. The question was, what does it mean for a wife to submit to her husband? So away we go. Lots of assumptions with this question. First of all, I want to define our terms a little bit. What is a wife and what is a husband? We've got some etymologies for these words that I think can help us a little bit. In the Old English, whiff, I guess it would have been pronounced, or whiffa maybe, was just a woman or a female person. So it didn't mean anything in relationship to um, to marriage. It just was a generic sense for a woman. And this sense is preserved for us in some of our modern words. Words and phrases like midwife does not refer specifically to someone who's married, but to a woman who helps other women to deliver their children. Or old wives' tales, not necessarily about people who are married, but just about old women telling tales about how the world works. But the specialized sense of wife referring to a female spouse began fairly early. Um, and even today, there are some languages that share some common roots with English that you still use the same word for woman and female spouse. So they're kind of closely related. And that makes sense because in the past, especially with European history, we kind of have the assumption that all women of a certain age will be married, will participate in the society and economy by producing offspring in their monogamous relationship with a man. So kind of makes sense that wife would refer in that way. And then we have husband, which in the Old English again referred to just a house dweller, a householder. Man, the word for man in general was were, as in our modern werewolf, man wolf. So husband was someone who was a dweller or holder of a house. In the late 13th century, husband started to refer to the male spouse in a relationship to wife as female spouse. But it continued to also refer to other types of husbands, stewards or managers of resources, through at least the 15th century. But even today, we have a little bit of that with husbandry as an area of study and practice in terms of, animal husbandry, perhaps, is the most common one that we still have today. But the sense of um, holding a house, holding responsibility for a household or for whatever it is that you are husbanding, like animals. Um, so there is this assumption in the word husband that that there is this sense of ownership, responsibility for something that is not yourself. So husband being in relationship to wife, perhaps we can make the assumption that even in the name that we have in English, husband, we assume that there is some level of responsibility and oversight of the wife, which, historically makes sense because women have not always been seen as fully human. They've been seen as property. They've been seen as, in need of some level of protection and oversight and direction from a male. So kind of makes sense that our words would make those kinds of references. So that kind of gives us a little bit of background when we think about this question from that perspective. And then another word that we've got in our question has to do with this idea of submission. What does it mean to submit? And oh, somebody trying to say something? No, just heard a little jerking. Okay. So there's something to do with power dynamics in this word, submission. Um, Submitting, according to some of the dictionary definitions that I looked at, talked about how you are yielding power, you are letting go of some kind of power. But it's interesting that in order to submit, you actually have to have some kind of power that you're going to yield in the first place. And so when we think about people who might, might have a more, I guess today we use the word traditional, but I don't think that that's completely appropriate. A more historically connected, perhaps understanding of the relationship between husband and wife, then the wife should not, or does not, or cannot have power that can be yielded. So we have to think about questions like, what power do I have when I am in a position of powerlessness or even oppression? Do I have any kind of power? Do I have any kind of agency within that position? And of course, in other types of relationships that involve significant power dynamics and power differentials, there's some ways in which there is some kind of agency, there is some kind of power that you have within yourself. Even in the worst of circumstances with chattel slavery, people could choose whether they were going to submit to the people that claim to own them. They could choose whether they would do what they were told to do. They could choose whether they would act out. Of course, they would then get terrible and completely unfair and unreasonable consequences for those actions. And so, part of the power dynamic was to have more and more that you could lord over someone, that it's not just their own life, because you can choose certainly to forfeit your own life rather than allow yourself to submit to someone that wants to lord power over you. But then, of course, if you have children, then the threat of harming them or killing them is a little different than the threat of harming or killing yourself if you have other loved ones. So the desire of the so-called owners of chattel slaves was to give them something to live for, give them something to feel that they were kind of stuck and that they had to submit. But there is some level of power even in the most oppressive of situations. You can always choose not to submit, not to give in. But then there are going to be, terrible negative consequences for you. And of course, there are some circumstances in which you can't even allow yourself to die, that they could control you to that kind of degree. But you I think you always have at least that that ability to decide, am I going to submit bodily? Am I going to submit in my mind? Am I going to let go of the little power that I do have in this situation? I think that is, those are some important things I think for us to keep in mind as we think about this question with the different terminologies that are involved in the question. So any questions or comments on any of that before we jump in? We're good? All right. So to kind of move away from our question a little bit and get some foundational information, I want to take us back to the same old thing that I'm always talking about in this class, the same old question, how should we read the Bible? We have to think about how we ought to engage a question like this when we're talking about when we're talking about biblical interpretation. How should we read the Bible? And so we can ask ourselves, what kind of direction is this? The passage that we'll look at here in a minute has language that is commanding us to do something, submit to your husbands, do this thing. And so we have to say, well, how do we respond to this? Is this an example of how times have changed? Is this something that we as Christians do need to take seriously and buy into? And so that kind of brings me to the history of interpreting the Bible in terms of law, in terms of rules. And Christians have struggled with this from the very beginning. Even within the Bible itself, there are examples of places where the earliest Christians are disagreeing about what the relationship should be and is between Christians and the law. And of course, at that time, they didn't have the New Testament. They were, writing it. They were living it. So at that time, their scriptures were the same as what the Jews had. And so some of the people who became Christians were Jews and some weren't, some were Gentiles. And so the questions, the questions started right away. Do you have to be Jewish in order to be a Christian? If so, what does it really mean to be Jewish? Do you have to, be related to somebody who was Jewish in order to be Jewish and therefore then Christian? Can you convert to Judaism? If you do convert to Judaism, what do you have to do in order to become a Jew? There are all kinds of laws in the scriptures that the Jews and Christians share in common that talk about some of that, about being circumcised and eating and participating in the various following of the law and the cultural stuff that comes along with being Jewish. All these things, worshiping in the temple. All these things were questions that the people had from the very beginning. What is our relationship to the law? And in order to answer those questions, they were asking then really, what is Jesus' relationship to the law? What has changed in relationship to people's need to follow the law or not because of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? And so this was a question that was important for people very early on and continued to be important for people for a long time. Eventually, when we got into the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the most famous Catholic teachers and philosophers and thinkers and theologians, came up with this concept of that there are three different types of law that you find in the Bible. There are laws that are moral laws that are binding forever. They are binding for us today. They were binding for him then. They were binding for the early Christians. They were binding for people before Christ. They were binding even before the law was handed down through Moses or even through Noah. These are concepts that are universal and applicable to all people in all times and in all places. Then Thomas says there are ceremonial laws. these are laws that were mostly related to forms of worship and ritual cleanliness for the Jewish people. And according to Thomas, these were commanded that for a particular time. They were supposed to foreshadow Christ. But he says they actually stopped being binding when Christ came and should not be observed because observing them would be an affront to Christ, would be offensive to who Christ is and what Christ did for us. He says that following the laws about how you should make sacrifices in the temple to atone for your sins is the same as denying that Christ came and took care of our sins for us. So if you continue to follow those ceremonial laws, you are actually you're actually offending Jesus. You're actually doing something that that is harmful to your relationship with God. And then there's a third kind of law, Thomas said, which is he calls the judicial law. He says that these are also temporary laws. They are not universally binding for all of forever and ever, but they are meant to point us toward universal principles of justice and who God is. So they're not things that you must do. They're not binding like the moral, eternally binding laws are, but they're okay to do. And they're also okay to have others do if you desire for the purpose of maintaining good order in your community. And so Thomas took all of these laws from what he then at that point was calling the Old Testament and also the New Testament and said, here are all the different kinds of laws, and I'm going to divide them into these categories so that now you know which laws you must follow, which laws you should not follow, you cannot follow, and which laws are optional for you to follow if you so choose or not if you don't want to. And so he divided out all of these different laws in this way because it's important for him that we maintain the truth of who Christ is. If Jesus died forever and always for our sins, or no, that was wrong. If Jesus died and rose again so that all of our sins will forever and always be forgiven, that's better. Then there are certain things that we cannot think are required of us because if they are, then we are undermining that truth for ourselves and for others who are observing us. So does that make sense to everyone that there's this kind of idea of different categories of laws? Now this is not the only way to understand the law and how we should read the law and how we should read the Bible. This is just what Thomas came up with. But I think that there are several different kinds of ways to read that that I think we need to really analyze and understand when we're thinking about these laws. Because even with Thomas, he is making the assumption that the Bible is a different kind of book, that you can't, you can't read the Bible in the same way that you read any other book, and that you shouldn't read any other book the same way that you read the Bible. We've even to today, we've got this kind of bizarre practice of reading the Bible by just picking it up and opening it to any place and saying, I'm going to start reading this and I'm going to find out, something that could be meaningful to me. And so what I wanted to do to kind of show as an example of how weird this is, because we don't really think about how strange this is, that this is how we read the Bible and nothing else. I wanted to give some examples of other books that if we read them in the same way that we read the Bible, let's see what they, how we might engage with them. So here is a passage from a fairly famous book. You might recognize what it is before I even tell you what it is. And I'm going to read this to you. Red, red, they call me red. Red bed, I am in bed. Red, Ned, Ted, and Ed in bed. So this is a passage from Dr. Seuss's Hop on Hop. And if we just pull a random page and we read a random passage and we look at it, we have to say to ourselves, okay, well, what does this mean for my life, right? Because that's what we do with the Bible. We just pick it up, we open it, we read one verse, and we ask ourselves, what does this mean for my life? So we have to look at this and we have to say, okay, well, we've got this person called Red, and there's something about being in bed, and there are multiple other people present in the bed, and so it's possible that what what we're supposed to be doing with our lives is making sure that we always sleep in bed with someone else. And here, all of the names of the people that are in the bed all rhyme. And so perhaps it's necessary that when you sleep, you never sleep alone, but you always sleep with people with whom you have rhyming names. It's legitimate, right? Based on what we're reading here. And that could be a rule that everybody decides that they need to follow because this is, how we read this book. A little bit perhaps more meaningful, randomly pulled page from a book. This is another Dr. Seuss. This is from The Lorax. It says, "You're slumping the pond where the humming fish hummed. No more can they hum, for their gills are all gummed. So I'm sending them off. Oh, their future is dreary. They'll walk on their fins and get woefully weary in search of some water that isn't so smeary." So here we can get a little bit, maybe there's a little more meat to this one, and maybe our interpretation isn't quite so odd. But, the same thing we could do. We could say, okay, well, there's something wrong with gumming up the gills of the humming fish. There's something morally inferior about our whatever it was that we've done to slump the pond. We are harming the humming fish, and so maybe the humming fish are superior to us. Maybe they're more important than we are. Our needs for slumping are less important than the needs of the humming fish to hum. Or maybe it's more of a universal thing. Maybe we need to be careful about our actions in relationship to other types of species because they have different needs than us. And then maybe we can even extrapolate out further and we can say, well, maybe what I do is it affects other people and other things. And so I need to think about, what it is that I'm doing and why and how my choices are going to impact other people. And I have to, make good moral choices based on that knowledge and reflection. I don't think that's a terrible takeaway from that particular passage, but to get that out of this tiny little, couple of sentences is kind of weird. But again, this is exactly what we do with the Bible. So I have one more example that I want to share with you. And this one, I'm not going to tell you where it's from either. The black rider flung back his hood, and behold, he had a kingly crown, and yet upon no head visible was it set. The red fire shone between it and the mantled shoulders vast and dark. From a mouth unseen came a deadly laughter. So this kind of sounds to me like something that might come out of the book of Revelation or something. So not that far afield from, what we've already got in our actual Bible. But this is actually from the Lord of the Rings series. This is from the chapter, The Siege of Gondor. And I want to read to you a quote from an author named Greg Gilbert, who talks about reading the Lord of the Rings in the same way that we read the Bible. He says, "Imagine if I read The Lord of the Rings with the main questions in my mind being, what does this mean for me? How can this help me be a better person? What lessons can I learn from this?" Again, you might wind up learning some important things reading the book like that, but you'd be fundamentally misunderstanding the story's aim. You'd be reading it in a fundamentally self-centered and far too self-aware way, when the aim of the story is really to sweep you away in the narrative, to carry you along in a story in which you are not the starring character, but in which the idea is to fall in love with other characters. That's how epic stories are meant to be read. Not as tiny little morality tales, but as horizon-busting, eye-bugging, world-broadening, even life-shaping experiences. So this guy, he writes, entire articles and books about how we ought to be reading the Bible, not as a source of little morality tales that are disconnected from one another, but as a huge epic narrative, a story that is at the level or even beyond the level of something like The Lord of the Rings in terms of world building and meaning and complexity and all the different characters that are involved and the complexity of those characters' emotions and decisions and relationships with one another. He says that this is what our Bible is. This is what our Bible is supposed to be. He says the reason why our Bible is not just a list of rules or just a list of here's everything you need to know about God is because God doesn't want it to be that way. God wants it to be something that will sweep us up, that will pull us in to the story and to being part of that story and making it a part of our lives and then making our lives part of the story. So questions on that. I'm going to jump over to something else a little different now.
Mhm.
We're good? All right, so when we're thinking about that, the epic story of the Bible, there are multiple different avenues that you can take to look at this. But one of the things that is important when we're talking about the New Testament and interpreting some of the directives in the New Testament, like our question for tonight, we need to talk about contextually, what are people dealing with? And we've talked about this in the past, but I wanted to bring it back to you. So we've got this idea of what is called the Day of the Lord, or otherwise known in Greek as the Parousia. And this comes from a variety of different sources in ancient Jewish tradition, but one of the easiest places for us to find it is in Daniel chapter 12. It says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So this is probably a pretty familiar image for even Christians because it's a popular and common understanding of what the judgment day is going to look like. But it's actually originally Jewish. We've got the day of the Lord when all of these things are going to occur. And on one side, before it happens, we've got this age. And then once it happens, then we've got the age to come. And as you heard within the passage, it said, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake." And so in order for everyone to be judged, we have to have the resurrection of the dead before we get to the day of the Lord. And whether that happens, minutes before the judgment begins or whether it happens a long time before the judgment begins, it doesn't say that, but it has to happen first. So we're in this age, eventually there will be the resurrection of the dead, then the day of the Lord and the judgment, and then we will be in the age to come. But what happens is we have this Jesus guy who shows up. And Jesus starts to talk about this day of the Lord. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 27, where's that? There it is. He says, "For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And then again in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus says, "Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." So for Jesus, this day of the Lord is imminent. It's happening now. It's right around the corner. And so when Jesus died and then was resurrected, the people thought, oh, well, this is, it's time. This is happening. They were expecting as soon as they felt the confirmation of the resurrection of Jesus, they immediately started thinking, oh, well, now all of our loved ones are going to come back, and this is going to usher in the day of the Lord and the age to come. And it's happening right now. Jesus said that, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. It's happening. It's finally here. All these years and generations that we've waited for this judgment, for God to vindicate us and for us to be ushered into this age to come, it's finally arrived. And so as after Jesus ascended and the people were left, the early church really bought into this. They said, okay, so Jesus is coming back any second. I will be with you always to the end of the age. I'll be back soon. Be ready. So how do we behave? How do we live if our belief is that Jesus is coming any minute? What is important and what isn't important? What are some things that you think would be critical if you knew that Jesus was coming any minute? Any ideas?
I don't think you could do anything. I mean, what's done is done. And we're expecting that we'll be just as we are.
Okay. So we just kind of wait, right? It's coming any second. Eating and sleeping aren't really important. Maybe if you get hungry, you can grab a sandwich on your way by, but Jesus is coming any minute. So you need to be aware. You need to be paying attention so that you don't miss out, so that you can participate in all of it as fully as possible. Maybe you want other people to know about this because you want them to be able to participate fully too, right? You want to share the message. And so you don't have a lot of time for other stuff. You don't have a lot of interest in things like, what are my neighbors going to think? Or if I start, acting bizarrely, is my family gonna reject me? Who cares? Jesus is coming back any minute. I've got to do everything I can to prepare myself and to prepare the people around me. And so if that means that I have to go out in the street corner and stop eating and stop caring about taking care of my home and throw all my money, into making sure that I can blare as loudly as possible this message to everyone that I can get my hands on, then that's fine, because Jesus is coming back literally any minute. That's really radical, right? And not a way that we think. But then, time starts passing. We think, oh, Jesus is coming back any minute, but then days go by, weeks go by, months start to go by, and things start to change. Okay, well, maybe Jesus isn't coming back any minute, but Jesus is coming back any day. He did promise that, this generation would not pass away before he came. And so it's any day now. And so maybe, eating and sleeping are kind of important, to make sure that we have enough stamina to get through the coming days until Jesus finally comes. But there are some things that we still really can throw out the window. We don't care about making money. We don't care about family building. We don't care about having children. We don't care about building a career. None of that's important, because any minute or any day now, Jesus is coming. And so we just have to survive enough to be able to keep on sharing that message and preparing ourselves as best we can. And so we get busy, we share the message with our words. We get out there, we ignore all the things that used to be important to us, like sustaining life and building long-term security for ourselves, because who cares? Jesus is coming any day. But then, as even more time starts to go by, people start to get worried. When is Jesus coming? And in fact, one of our earliest letters from Paul has questions about this that he is trying to answer. The people in Thessalonica are asking him, and we, of course, we don't have the original letter from them to him that we response. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul addresses this issue. He says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died." So what Paul is addressing here is people have started to die, right? Jesus promised that people wouldn't die before all of this started to happen, but then people start to die. And so they don't know what to do with this. And this worries them that they don't know, they don't know what's happening. They don't know what has happened to these people that they love who have died. And so Paul is comforting them. He's saying, no, of course, the people who were faithful, who have died in the last couple of months or couple of years will be part of this. And in fact, they will get more glory than us because they died in the faith. And so they'll get to go before us. But notice it says, though, we who are alive, who are left, will by no means precede those who have died. So not only can we understand here that he is lifting up those who have died, but he is still under the assumption that we, including himself, will be left. He is assuming that he will not die before Jesus shows up. And so we have to, we have to look at the slow shift that occurred as time started to pass and people had to grapple with, what does it mean that Jesus is coming back, and when and how long do we have to wait? Because for every day that passes, we have to start to make different decisions. The calculus of how we ought to live our lives changes. So when the parousia, when the day of the Lord is no longer imminent, but is delayed, what happens? Our priorities start to shift. And then another issue comes up, that the people that we're talking to about this, they aren't buying in the way that we thought that they would. So many people aren't jumping in to this movement. They aren't accepting this amazing news. And so how does that affect how we decide to behave, especially when a lot of those people who reject us, reject our message, reject our changed priorities, are people who have authority in our lives. They are our spouses. They are our masters if we're slaves. They are our parents. They are our teachers. They are our government officials. What do we do when we have this assumption that everything has changed and our priorities have to completely shift, but then other people don't have that and they have other expectations for us, particularly when they have some kind of authority in our lives? And so as time goes on, things, these questions continue to develop and continue to boil up. So we have in 2 Peter, the letter that is associated with Peter, second one, it talks about this again. It says in chapter 3, it says, "First of all, you must understand this, that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and indulging their own lusts, and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since our ancestors died, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation.' But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like 1 day. The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some think of slowness, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance." So now we've gotten to a point where the parousia, the day of the Lord, is so delayed that people are actually using that information to mock, to scoff at these people. Ha ha, you thought that Jesus was coming tomorrow, and so you gave away all your money and you sold all your property, and now you're poor and you're living on the street corner, and you're, spending all your time with all these weirdos, and you're doing all these strange things that I don't understand. You clearly made a terrible decision. Why did you do that? Because clearly that's not what's happening here. He promised that he would come, but look, he's not here. Everything has continued to be the same as it was from the very beginning. And so now the author has to say bigger things, has to say more sweeping things, has to understand why it's taking so long. Why is Jesus not here yet? And for him, the answer is, remember, guys, that this is God we're talking about. And so for us, it might feel like a long time, but it's not a long time. For God, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like one day. God has a different timeline. God has a different understanding of the passage of time. And think about what it would mean if this wasn't delayed. Think about all of your loved ones who have not come to faith. Think about yourself if you weren't right there on the very first day. Would you have come to repentance in time? God is actually giving you an opportunity. God is being patient with us so that we can build up this community and hopefully get everyone to come to repentance before the day of the Lord, so that this judgment that we're all going to be facing will come out well for everyone. So that's why it's delayed. So when those people scoff at you, you can tell them, hey, you better be glad that it's delayed, because otherwise you'd already be judged harshly, and you'd be in a place you don't like. So this is the context in which we find ourselves when we are looking at a question like, what does it mean for a wife to submit to her husband? But why? What does this have to do with our question at all? Well, there are two passages in our Bible that have this same language about wives submitting to their husbands. But I want to look specifically at the example in 1 Peter. First of all, because I know a lot more about it, frankly. I did a lot more study on 1 Peter than I did on Ephesians. And then also, there is a lot of scholarly disagreement and confusion about the Ephesians passage. It doesn't necessarily fit or make very much sense. Some scholars even believe that the passage about wives submitting to their husbands is an addition to the text that was put in there after the fact and wasn't original to the writing. And some would say, so what? It's in there now. It's part of our Bible, so we've got to deal with it. But others would say, no, we want it to be as original as possible. And if it wasn't in the original, then that means it's not really from God. And so we don't need to follow it. But the passage in 1 Peter is not as complicated as that in terms of whether or not it belongs in the original context of the letter. So we're going to talk specifically about the 1 Peter passage. Some of you were at church when I did recently the program on 1 Peter, because Pastor Bob was preaching on 1 Peter through the Easter season. But I'll kind of give you a little bit of a summary of all of that quickly. So we've got this situation in 1 Peter. This is scholars believe that 1 Peter was written about the year 100-ish, maybe a little bit earlier, but not too much earlier or later than that. And it was written to a diverse group of cultural and ethnic minorities. These are people who are living in the rural areas all across what we now know to be Turkey. And they are getting treated poorly because they have heard the good news of Jesus Christ, and they have changed their lives. They've changed their behaviors because of it. And what the content of that poor treatment is there's a lot of debate about that, but there's definitely some kind of negative response from someone in the community who has some kind of authority over these people, whether it's social authority because they are minorities and the people that are being mean to them aren't, or whether it's a little bit more formalized persecution from the government or something in between. We're not sure, but it has something to do with, with their behavior and this negative response that they're getting. So they have to ask themselves some questions. How do I live as a Christian in this hostile environment? How do I live as a Christian if people that are in my social circle aren't Christians? Do I, should I reject them? Should I stay in relationship with them? Should I be constantly trying to convince them that they're wrong? Should I just let it go? What should I do? How do I live as a Christian if people who have authority over my life aren't Christians and have other expectations for me? Do I ignore those expectations? Do I kind of live outside of the bounds of, of the way that my former social world wants me to live? What do I do? And so we get passages like these two that we see in First Peter. First, the one that is the famous one that we're asking the question about tonight. First Peter 3:1-2. Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. So there's this in the same way, which means that we need to go backwards. We can't do what we did with the Dr. Seuss and the Lord of the Rings and just pull a random chunk out and say, this is all I need to understand what this is. We have to go back and we have to say, in the same way as what? If you go immediately before this First Peter chapter 3, it has another example that talks about slaves and their relationship to their masters. But then if you go back a little bit more before that one, we find out what exactly it is that we're actually talking about here. So this is First Peter chapter 2, starting with verse 11. It says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor." So what we have to look at here is that context again. We can't just pull something out of its context and say, well, this is what it says on the face of it. Wives, submit to your husbands, accept the authority of your husbands. Why? Why should I do that? Because there are other places in my Bible that say there is no longer Jew nor Greek, there is no longer slave nor free, there is no longer male nor female. So what do I do with that? And that is exactly what these people in this context are asking. The exact question that we come up with there. We have to ask the question, what does it mean? What is the context of this? And so thinking about the struggle, the historical context of this particular letter, but then also the larger literary context of our Bible, remembering that the Bible is not just a collection of writings, but it's a sweeping epic. It's a story about what God is up to in the world and has been up to in the world over the course of all of human history. And so when we read in that kind of way, how does our understanding of this question about wives submitting to their husbands change? Well, we have to think about who these people are and what kind of decisions they're facing. We thought about earlier, if I'm in a situation where my life, my priorities have changed so dramatically that nobody around me recognizes me, what's the right way to respond to them? Should I cut them off from my life? Should I try to force them to believe as I do? Well, that's probably not going to happen because most of the time these people have power over me. And if I'm in a powerless role in that relationship, then I can't force them to do anything. And so what do I do? Should I, when I'm being when people are arguing with me, should I be antagonistic to them? Should I flaunt my differences? Should I, rub in their face that I'm doing this completely different thing? I know the truth. I know that because of Christ, there is no longer male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And so I should behave in according to that truth. I should be living in a community of equality where everyone has gifts to offer. But the world around me does not want me to do that. They're threatened by that. And so how do I respond? Do I say, I don't care what you think? I'm doing this because this is what God wants me to do? Or do I respond differently? So I think what it comes down to is we have to look at not just the context, but also, also that literary sweeping, that context of what is God up to in the world. And there are other examples of this kind of thing that we encounter, even in books of our Bible that were written in sort of similar time periods. Some of them much earlier. But for example, in First Corinthians, Paul has been asked about eating meat that has been sacrificed to pagan idols. Some of the people in the community say, well, we can eat the meat sacrificed to pagan idols because we know, as followers of God, that there is only one God. And so all these gods that they are supposedly sacrificing their meat to and then eating it doesn't matter because it's all empty. There are no other gods that they're actually sacrificing this animal to. And so it's just meat. It's just food. I can eat this. It's totally fine. But other people are concerned about this. Other people don't like what it looks like, even if they understand where the people's arguments are coming from, they don't like what it looks like. It looks like these Christians are participating in this pagan ritual of eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And so Paul says, hey, stop arguing about this, first of all, because that's not a good look. Let's have some unity here. But secondly, think about what is the good news from the other person's point of view. Is it better to flaunt something in somebody's face? Is it better to be argumentative? Is it better to fight and push people away? Or is it better to embrace people, to understand what their limitations are, to attempt to live in such a way that your life looks more like a carrot than a stick, so to speak? Because we know that the carrot is much more effective in changing your own circumstances, because people will be more likely to respond well to you if you treat them with respect and dignity. And then therefore they might even be persuaded by watching you. And it says that in our First Peter book, our First Peter letter. It talks about how, your behavior as a submissive wife who is being kind and gentle to her husband, even though they don't have agreement philosophically and theologically anymore, that is much more likely to bring him around than arguing and fighting and battling in that relationship, or leaving the relationship entirely. But this is now makes it really, really complicated, because it's not just, oh, well, this passage says that I, as a wife, should submit to my husband, and so I'm going to go and do that. Instead, I have to say, okay, so the meaning behind this passage is that I need to stop and think about what my relationship is to God and to other believers and to non-believers and to people who don't agree with me and to people who do agree with me. And I have to figure out how to navigate all these complex relationships that I have in my life, and then I actually have to do something. I can't just sit around and think about what does this mean and how what might this look like. I actually have to do something. I have to behave. I have to decide what I'm going to do because this is my life and I can't just sit around waiting for Jesus to come because it's delayed. I've got to do something. I've got to live. I've got to support my family, or I've got to, stay alive myself so that I can continue to do God's work in the world. What does that look like? And that is a really, really complicated question. I love this kind of summarizing passage from Colossians, which is what I'm going to wrap us up with tonight. Colossians chapter 4, verse 5 says, "Conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone." So, where is that line? Seasoned with salt is my favorite part of that. You should always be gracious. You should always be kind. You should always do your very best to welcome in anyone with any perspective into a conversation and a relationship with you, because that is, that's what it means to be a Christian. But there has to be that little bit of saltiness in there. There has to be that little bit of challenge in there. And so how do you make that happen in a way that, again, takes us back to what does good news look like for this person that is still consistent with and faithful to who I believe I am and who I believe God is. And that is not an easy answer. When we encounter people in the world and they expect certain things of us because we're Christians, and then we say no. With our Good Water Crossing program is a perfect example. We had a neighbor sitting out front of our church with a sign that said, "Pastor Bob does not love his neighbor," because in that person's view, we are choosing to put dangerous criminals in our backyard right next to her backyard. And so Pastor Bob is not loving his neighbor because she is literally the neighbor of the church, and we're choosing to put her in harm's way. That's her perspective on this. But we know deep in our hearts who God is, and we know that the right thing to do is to serve the most vulnerable people in our community, even though it's hard, even though it's challenging, even though it's a little scary. And so how do we interact with this person? Do we laugh at her? Do we scoff at her? Do we tell her that she's an idiot? Do we ignore her? Do we do we cut off any potential relationship with her? Do we dismiss her as, a lost cause? What do we do with that? What she thinks is the good news is that we would go to her and we would say, "Oh yes, we're going to stop working on this project. We're going to abandon it because, clearly this is the wrong thing to do. You're completely right. We were wrong. We're going to stop doing this." But we know that that's not faithful to who we know God to be and who we know God is calling us to be. And so how do we find that way forward? And how do we then, I didn't even bring up things like making sure that we are taking care of ourselves in terms of our mental health and our physical health. There for a while, I was encountering these people a lot, and I was really having a hard time emotionally because all I was getting was just, all this negativity and anger and frustration, and it was just getting piled on me and piled on me and piled on me until the point where I said, I have to take a break. I need somebody else to, be the person that's taking this on, because I can't keep allowing myself to be put into these situations and maintain, my own mental health. And now I've reached a point where I probably should be able to jump back in, but I don't want to. Frankly, I just don't want to. I didn't like it. I didn't like being the person that these people were, felt comfortable screaming and yelling at, and, telling I was a terrible person and going on the internet and saying awful things about me to their friends. I didn't like that. And so I don't want to do it anymore, but I have to figure out, how am I going to navigate through this in a way that's going to allow me to survive and, not burn me out, but also, be faithful to who God is, be faithful to who I am, and also show that person, show those people that even though they're not treating me humanely, I believe that they are children of God as well. And I don't know the answer to that question. And there are a lot, that's only one example. There are endless examples in our lives of how we have to navigate through these things. So, what does it mean to be gracious but seasoned with salt in any given situation? I cannot tell you. But when it comes to this question about, a wife submitting to her husband, I think that at that time, in that context, what it meant was to stay in that relationship, to not break the bonds that God gave you, not break the relationships that God gave you, but also to make sure that within that context, you are using your opportunities to show that person who has authority in your life the reasons why you are who you are and believe what you believe. Show them with your actions. If you can't use your words because they're not hearing the words, use your actions to evangelize, to tell people about Jesus, and leave it up to the Holy Spirit to work in the life of that person, whether that looks like, they convert to Christianity within their lifetime and within your lifetime, or whether it looks like they, harass you and treat you poorly for the rest of their lives. um, you have to balance that, but you have to balance it in your own context. And so I don't think that there is a hard and fast rule that wives must submit to their husbands just because it says that in the Bible. I think that what it's telling us is, where's the line and how do we navigate through all of these different complicated elements of this? I don't think it's wrong that certain women are, at one safe place. I don't think it's wrong that certain women divorce their husbands because they can't, they can't make their relationship work, or they are abused in some way, because God doesn't want that for us. But going from one extreme to the other, I think is not the right thing to do. I think we have to live it. We have to sit in it. We have to sit with the complexity, sit with the contradictions, and ask God to, help us to sift through it and figure out what's the most faithful response. And submitting to your husband point blank, no, full stop, is not the answer. Even though that's what the text itself says. But we have to look behind it. We have to look at the context, is where I would fall with this particular question. So that is what I have for us today. Questions, comments, disagreements?
I love how you take a quote unquote simple statement and put it in such a big perspective. make us see it beyond the mere words that we read.
Well, that's why I always bring up that question of, how do we read the Bible? Because we have to look at those bigger questions if we're going to get to the right answer. And there are people out there who would say that I'm just creating avenues to get myself out of it because I don't like what it says. And so I'm making excuses, I'm figuring out ways to get around it. But I would read them hop on pop. I would say, why is the Bible a thing that you can just pick up and open up to any passage and read it, and just take that sentence as is, but none other is? Why is it different? And what are you missing out on because you read the Bible that way and you don't read it as a wider story about who God is, and then figure out how those individual little pieces fit into that bigger picture of who God is? But it makes it more complicated for sure. I wish it was as easy as open up and there it is. It'll tell you what to do right there.
Well, I would propose that this statement could also be in the 21st century. husbands submit to your wives.
Could be.
I mean, I don't think it's limited to the husband-wife relationship.
No, I don't think so. I think what it really means is honor the relationships that you have and the relationships that you build, and, try to figure out a way forward in a way that is faithful without, without compromising the humanity and the child of Godness of the person that you're dealing with. And that, you can't always do that. You can't, you can't in this world always do that perfectly, but to try, to not go immediately to the deep end and say, oh, well, I'm a Christian and you're not, so I'm divorcing you tomorrow. To say, I want to honor our relationship. I want to see, how we might be able to work this out together. But if it doesn't work out, then that's kind of part of the sinfulness of the world, and hopefully someday we'll be able to have that conversation with God about, why can't it just be easier?
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
All right. Anything else from anybody?
No.
Okay. Well, then I thank you all for being here, and we're going to
Thank you.
we're going to take a break now for the summer. So keep your eye on your email, and I will let you know when things are going to gear up again, and I'll get you a new link and all that fun stuff. But for now, I hope everybody has a good summer. I know I'll see many of you at church
Yes.
and such. Hopefully we'll get you back a little bit too, Karen. We want you to be there for some of our summer series stuff. It'll be much more fun in person with some of our activities we have planned.
I know. I've been thinking about that too. I'm trying.
I'll take Cindy up on her offer. She'll come and get you.
I know.
I will indeed. I will indeed. It just makes a loop. It's not out of my way. It just makes a loop.
And then
Yeah.
she'll have an excuse to stop somewhere and get herself a treat that she doesn't typically get because she doesn't go on that side of town. Think about it that way.
Uh,
All right. Well, thank you, friends.
Thank you,
Hope you
Katie.
have a
We'll
good
see you on
evening.
Sunday.
Katie.
Hey, Katie, did you get my email, my text?
I did. Yes, I've got to.
Can
take a
we
look
touch
at that.
base? Can we touch base tomorrow or the next day?
Yes.
Yeah.
sounds
Well,
good.
tomorrow's Friday. Oh my goodness, Friday's tomorrow. So, yeah, I'll be working on it on Saturday. So just let me know.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you, hon.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great class.
Bye.
yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.